Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to use shadow work to discover the game that you're unconsciously playing. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you a dynamic that every single human being engages with, and most people engage with this dynamic unconsciously. And once you become aware of this dynamic, you can have a lot more empowerment over your sense of meaning in life. And so because this dynamic is unconscious, what we're doing is essentially we're using shadow work to make the unconscious conscious so that you can become aware of how you're engaging in this dynamic. And that dynamic is that every single one of us projects games onto reality. And these games are how we create meaning as human beings, because what a game is you have an objective that you project onto reality, and then you create interactive meaning with whatever it is that pertains to that objective that you're trying to achieve. And what you want to consider is that there are no games that exist outside of the context of the human mind. So let's say that you have a court of hopscotch squares. So you have like 10 squares there, I think it is, with hopscotch. There is no game of hopscotch inherent in those squares. Your mind has to project those meanings onto it for a game to exist. The same thing is true with a deck of cards. You can play and project many games onto a deck of cards, but there are no games inherent in the pieces of cardboard with the images on it that you call cards. So there are no games outside in reality. All games exist up here in the human mind, and we human beings, we project games onto everything. And games can be more complex and games can be more simple, but what games are essentially is interactive stories. Stories that we can actually take part in, and this is how we actually feel connected to reality, and it's how we create meaning within reality. Now, in the way that we usually think of games, we usually think of things like football or baseball or hopscotch or tic-tac-toe or even Russian roulette or, other games like this, board games, card games, anything like that. That's the way that we usually think of games. But games are actually way more all-encompassing than that. We as human beings can project games onto anything, and even things that we don't think of as games are actually games. And so remember, games are projected interactive meaning, and we have a certain objective and we have certain rules and procedures for how we can achieve that objective. So all you need to have a game is an objective and rules for winning and losing at that objective. And we'll talk more later about the components of what a game is, but let me go through some uncommon examples of games that we don't usually think of as games. So to start with, we have work. Work of any and all kinds are games, because with work you have an objective that you're projecting onto reality, and there are ways you can win or lose at producing that objective. So if you're a teacher, the objective is to teach your students, and there are ways to do that successfully and unsuccessfully. Or if you're a mechanic, the objective is to fix the car, and there are ways to do that successfully or unsuccessfully. Or if you're a dishwasher, your objective is to wash all the dishes, and you can do that successfully or unsuccessfully as well. Now, we don't usually think about these things as games because we usually think about games as frivolous and fun, but games don't need to be frivolous or fun. They just need to have an objective and a way to win or lose relative to that objective. Also, commerce and money is 100% a game. So first off, money, they're just little slips of green paper or numbers in a bank account, and the idea is you have to collect as many of those slips of paper as possible compared to the things that you want to buy, and somebody who goes into business tries to sell things and and services and things like that to get more money, and so this whole thing is a game. The legal system is also a game because there are certain rules that you have to follow, and if you lose at that game, you might end up getting fines and fees and end up in jail and on probation and all sorts of other things. So there are ways to win or lose at that objective. Institutions of any and all kinds are games because you have a certain objective that each institution is trying to fulfill, and then you have a variety of different players that have different roles that are meant to try to bring about the objective. And again, an institution can be either successful or unsuccessful at producing those outcomes. And that can be a business institution, an academic institution, or even a religious institution. speaking of which, religion also functions as a game because you have a certain objective and there are certain rules to follow. And if you follow those rules, you're winning at the objective. If you're not following those rules, you're losing at the objective. And if we look at culture more broadly, culture is like a playground. It is a collection of many, many games. And another thing that's very important to note about this is that the play of baby animals is designed to prepare them for their adulthood roles. So let's say baby lion cubs, they will fight together in order to prepare themselves to learn how to fight for their adulthood roles as adult lions. And for children, when we play, what we do is we play games and we play pretend. And so pretend is all of the different personas and roles that we have to step into as adults in order to function in society. And when we play games, that's like our engagement in all the various institutions and work and all these other things that we have to do as adults. And we often don't think about child's play in reference to our preparation for adult roles because we don't realize that we're playing games and we don't realize that we're playing pretend. We think that we're engaged in serious business. And in truth, we are engaged in serious business, but games are serious business. And depending on how you look at it, the playground is either a microcosm of human society or human society is a macrocosm of the playground. And in terms of how we think about like raising our children to be successful in adulthood, we don't usually think about play as having this huge impact on that. Maybe in the abstract, but we don't realize that one-to-one correlation between the games that we play as children and the games that we play as adults in order to engage in society. And that's precisely why we go unconscious to the games that we're playing, because we don't think about them as games. We don't realize that they're games. We don't realize that we're engaging in something of make-believe. Now, I'm going to share with you the components of a game. So as I had said before, games are projected interactive meaning. So games exist only up here. We project them out onto reality, and this gives us a sense of meaning in our interactions with external reality. And we absolutely need to play games in order to derive a sense of meaning from the actions we're engaging in. And with a game being basically an interactive story, we need to have a sense that this story has some kind of important meaning that we're engaging with that connects us to reality. And so here are the components of a game. So to begin with, we have an objective. Now, an objective can be two different things, and of course it's going to be different in terms of the content of the objective for every single game that we might play, but we can either have the objective of winning the game or avoiding losing the game until time runs out. So to give some examples of a winning game, where it's like you're actually trying to do something in the positive, let's say that capture the flag, the objective of the game is to actually capture the flag. And once you've captured the flag, that means that you've won the game. Now, if you're playing a game that has an objective to avoid losing until time runs out, you have a game like Jenga, where you're trying to keep things going as long as possible and trying to make sure that you're the one that doesn't knock over the tower. Or you might even have that game where people run on floating logs and you got to make sure that you don't fall off before your opponent does. Now, if we take this into the context of things we don't usually think of as games, we can have an objective relative to, let's say, the game that we play at work. So, for example, my objective here is to create a good video. And so that's the game that I'm playing right now as I'm creating this video. And so that's an objective where I'm trying to win. But let's say that I was a politician and my game was to try to avoid having a bill that I disagree with get passed. And so maybe my job would be to filibuster things within that game. And so with filibustering, that's about making sure that you don't lose before the time runs out. So games always have an objective. They also always have rules that you have to engage in order for the gameplay to actually be meaningful and to make sense. So let's say you're playing the game Pin the Tail on the Donkey, and one of the rules is that you have to wear a blindfold, and if you don't wear a blindfold and you pin the tail on the donkey, well, the game doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't make sense. Basically, anybody who can see can pin the tail on the donkey without the blindfold. Or let's say that you're playing the game of being a business owner who sells a bunch of goods. Well, one of the rules of that game is that, people have to buy the goods fair and square. You can't coerce them into buying the goods. You can't threaten them with violence so that they buy the goods. Otherwise, you're running afoul of the legal game and you're doing things that are against the law. There's also procedures to a game. So there are ways that you play. So the rules of the game are things you can and cannot do. The procedures of the game are the way that you engage with the game. So let's say that you're playing a video game, and the procedures of the game are that there are certain buttons that you push to make the character that you're playing do certain moves. Or let's say that somebody's playing the game of being a priest in the Catholic Church. There are going to be certain rituals for playing that game, certain ways to conduct the Mass, certain ways to, let's say, give the Eucharist, all of these different things. Another component that every game has is winning moves and losing moves. And winning moves are things that you can do within the gameplay in order to increase your chances of winning relative to the objective, and losing moves are things that you can do that gets in the way of your ability to win the game. So for example, if I'm playing basketball, a winning move would be something like shooting the ball in the hoop, but a losing move would be missing the hoop. So to give some examples of winning and losing moves relative to games that we might play that we don't typically consider games, let's take the social game, and our desire to belong and maybe come across a particular way. And maybe someone's social game that they're playing is that they're trying to build themselves an identity that's very charismatic. And so winning moves would be any time that that person can engage with people in a way that is charismatic. And losing moves would be like social awkwardness or sort of fumbling the ball in terms of the interactions with other people. Another component that's present in almost all games are consequences and rewards for losing and winning moves respectively. So let's say that there's a game when you make a winning move, maybe that helps you score more points within the game. But if you get a losing move, maybe you just don't gain any points, or maybe it's the case that you lose points as well. Now there are some games that don't have any positive rewards, where it's just about trying to avoid getting losing moves as much as possible. So to give an example of a game with no in-game reward, it would be sort of like that running on a floating log game, where it's like you really have to get to the end of the game before you know that you won. So it's mostly while you're actually in the game, playing the game for the round, it's just trying to stay up on the log and trying not to falter. And unfortunately, we can also play games in our life that has no reward. Let's say that we play the game of financially treading water by staying in a dead-end job that we don't like to do. And so what we're doing is we're treading water and we're trying to avoid going bankrupt, or we're trying to avoid unemployment, we're trying to avoid losing our home. So while games with no in-game reward can be quite fun because there's a limited amount of time and there's like the stakes aren't super high, it can be very, very stressful to play games with no rewards when we're projecting games onto other components of reality. So those are the main components of all games. And it's important to note that these components of a game and them being exercised consistently is what helps us create a sense of meaning with our interactions with the world at large. So there's no inherent meaning to things outside of ourselves beyond the stories and games that we project upon the reality. And we need to be able to project games and stories in order to engage in reality and actually have a solid sense of meaning and trajectory in our lives. And so when I had mentioned that games are not just child play, I really mean it, because it really truly is how we derive meaning. And if it's the case that we feel like we're playing a game that's unwinnable, or we are not into our game, we're not invested in our game, we feel like we can't win our game, what ends up happening is that we can really lose our sense of meaning in life. And in this regard, not all games are equal. We can project some games onto reality that can steal our sense of meaning away, that can make us feel like we're playing a futile game, whereas other types of games might be much more empowering for us to play. And we're going to go deeper into that later on in the video, but first I wanted to share a little bit about the book called Things Fall Apart. So it's a book that I read for the first time back when I was in high school. I didn't really pay attention all that much when I was reading the book the first time through. But then when I was a teacher, a substitute teacher, a long-term substitute teacher, I had to actually teach the book to high schoolers. And this was maybe about 10 years ago. And it really stuck out to me, at how much this book related to the concept of a game. So this book, Things Fall Apart, is set in a fictional village in Nigeria in the 1890s. And the main character in the story is named Okonkwo. And Okonkwo is really winning at the whole entire game of this village. So he's very high status, he's very successful, he has multiple wives, he's just really seen as a pillar of the community. Now, in contrast to Okonkwo winning the many games that are in this particular culture, in this particular village, there are also people that are talked about in the story that are not winning the game of the village. And there's one memory that sticks out to me, that there was this woman who kept having twin babies. And in the fictional village in this story, the community believes that the twins are a sign of like sort of an evil doppelganger situation. And so what the culture is to kill twin babies whenever they are born. And so this woman, she's had twins like 2 or 3 times. And so every single time that she has babies, her babies are killed. And so she is someone in the story that's suffering major losses within the game that's played within this culture. And then some ways into the story, once the status quo of the culture is set up and certain rules of the collective game that's being played are understood, what ends up happening is that Christian missionaries come in and they start imposing a different game. And so what happens is that Okonkwo, because he is winning the game of the culture, he is very, very against the Christian missionaries. But one of the first people to go over to the Christian missionaries to play a different game is this woman who has had like all the twins. And eventually, little bit by little bit, more and more of that village, stops playing the usual game of the culture of the village and starts playing the Christian missionary game. And the Christian missionary game involves totally different gameplay, totally different rules, totally different, ways to win that game. And even Okonkwo's son ends up going over and joining the Christian missionaries and sort of converting to Christianity. And Okonkwo had made some comments earlier on in the story about his son being effeminate and like wishing that his son wasn't so effeminate and being more like him. And so because maybe the son didn't quite feel like he fit in with that culture, he ended up sort of like going off and playing a different game. And so throughout the story, little bit by little bit, the game gets eroded more and more and more. And you can see this in the title, Things Fall Apart, that it's about Okonkwo's game that he was playing and he was winning, and it falls apart underneath him because so many people from that village end up going to play a different game. And now suddenly that game loses its collective meaning and sort of the center falls out of it. And because the culture gets divided into these 2 different systems and these 2 different games that operate off of a totally different sense of meaning, that's what ends up happening. The village ends up falling apart. And what ends up happening is that Okonkwo is quite the tragic character. So he ends up having the game that he's winning pulled out from underneath him. And one of the things that it's like makes the story quite interesting is that his dad, he had always seen his dad as kind of a loser of the game. His dad wasn't successful. And so he was always trying to be successful in the games that he was playing, within the culture, in order to avoid being like his dad. And so now all of that success, all of that which was meaningful to him, his whole entire identity essentially gets pulled out from under him because the game erodes underneath him. And so the story ends up in quite a tragic place because of the erosion of this game. And I won't spoil the exact ending or anything like that, but it just shows the importance of the games that we play and how invested we can get in playing a game. And so when we think about things that we traditionally think about as games, we go, oh, that's just child's play. Games are no big deal. But as I had said before, games are where we derive our entire sense of meaning. Every bit of meaning that we make comes through the context of a game. And so I really recommend checking out this book and thinking about it through the context of games and how important it is that we feel like we are engaged in a consistent story, a consistent meaning, a consistent game, where we feel like we know how we can win that game, and we know what the objective is, and we know what our purpose is. All of these things very important for us to keep a sense of meaning and to be able to feel like life isn't futile. So the games that we play can be quite all-encompassing. And ultimately, it's our parents' job to teach us the original game. And the original game that our parents indoctrinate us into and teach us through modeling their own behaviors, we end up actually projecting out onto the universe at large. And this tends to be the unconscious game that includes all the other games that we might play. So there tends to be a large macrocosmic game that we're engaged in consciously, but that we're not necessarily aware. So when our childhood caregivers are raising us, what they're doing is they're either overtly or indirectly teaching us the rules of this game, the objective of this game, and we start to project that onto the universe at large, and then that comes to shape our whole entire relationship with life. We also tend to project this game onto our God image, and some games are better and some games are worse for giving us a sense of meaning in life. So basically, we want our game to always be consistent. So if we are dealing with inconsistent parenting, what ends up happening is that inconsistency becomes part of the gameplay, or it feels like the game just falls apart or can't quite coalesce. And so any inconsistent game is going to be worse than a consistent game. And so if you are in the process of raising a child and being a caregiver to a child, one of the best things that you can do for them is to sort of indoctrinate them into a consistent game where they know how to win and they know how to lose and they know what the objective is. And we'll get into how to create a good game for yourself or your children later on in the video, but I wanted to first talk to you about my game that I was originally indoctrinated into as a child and that I still have a tendency to project onto reality to some degree. And my game combined both very positive elements and very negative elements at once. And so one of the things that my parents were really, really good at was admiring the things that were different and special about me and being able to celebrate those differences. And, so I was constantly celebrated for, being intelligent or, achieving something. And it was the case that it was really meaningful to my parents whenever I would, do something, like let's say I would do something at school that they were impressed with. And they both were really good at showing a sense of awe at my achievements. Like they'd both be like, oh, wow, like this type of thing. And so this was really, really reinforcing my sense of self. And even to this day, I still have a very strong sense of self-efficacy and I have a lot of self-belief because of that. But on the more negative side of things, I found that I didn't get a lot of attention unless I was achieving something or doing something special or superlative. And in fact, there were even elements of like my dad kind of being in his own world and being kind of clicked off, and it's super difficult to kind of get him to connect and difficult to get his attention because he's kind of distant. And then my mom would have this dynamic where she would kind of stonewall me and like shut me out and things like this. And so I had this sense that, my ability to connect with her and to have her as a presence in my life was very conditional. And so it's given me this sense of like, oh, I have to be achieving a certain way in order to get connection. And there's overall this sense of sort of alienation or this sense of disconnection that comes from that. And so what I understood as the objective of the game, and I was projecting this onto reality unconsciously, especially when I was a teenager, was that my objective of the game was to be different than other people, to be leaning into what makes me different and special, and to achieve things that other people cannot through like hard work and through just finding the things about me that were sort of unique advantages that I have. And so I'd say the objective of the game was very clear, very consistent, and very inspiring because there were things to move toward. It wasn't an avoid losing game, it was like a winning game, and that winning game has been really helpful for me. But on the opposite side, the consequences of not doing that were that the universe will abhor me, I will no longer belong in reality, and I will permanently have a black mark on me that will mean that I don't deserve to exist as a human being. And as a teenager, this is 100% the game that I was operating off of at the time, and it's taken me a long time to actually shift the rules of my game to where I feel like, at least on the level of like achieving things, that I don't need to do that in order to validate my own existence. But bear in mind, I wasn't explicitly taught this game. It was in the way that my parents would interact with me that the positive and the negative elements of this game came to fruition, and it came to be projected not only onto the universe at large, but also onto my God image. And every single parent and caregiver of children is shaping the game that the child believes that they're playing and the game that the child projects onto reality. So if you're a parent or caregiver to children, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have a consistent game, that you have a winning game where they're actually moving towards something positive, that they feel like they are equipped to be able to achieve the objective of that game, so they have a sense of self-efficacy. But you also want to have a sense that they don't have to win the game to ensure that they're loved, or win the game to get connection, or win the game to be valid. So here are some components of a good game, and again, this is for you or for the child that's in your care. So the first thing you want is you want a clear objective. You want to make sure that it is super clear, that you know what it is that you're aiming for within this life, and that your child knows what they're aiming for in this life. And one of the things that's come up for me as a coach, because I've worked with lots of people and I've discussed kind of the games that they're playing and helped them become conscious of the games that they're playing, is that sometimes people don't get a clear sense of what the game is because their parents weren't clear about what the game was. And so this creates this sense of confusion and like, okay, what am I doing here anyway? So you want to make sure that you have a clear objective, or that you communicate to your child that they have a clear objective. For me, my clear objective was to be as special as possible and to achieve as many things as possible and to do things that utilize my unique talents. Now, another component you want to have in yours and your child's game is consistency relative to the objective, the rules, the procedures, the winning and losing moves, the consequences, and the rewards. So you don't want any of the goalposts to be moved. And so one of the things that can really create a problem is if like a person had a situation where, like, let's say that they would get a 99% on a test and they would take it to their parent, and the parent would say, okay, well, it was a 99, but why not 100? And so what this indicates is that the margin of victory is very narrow and that the goalposts will continue to move. And so what happens when somebody internalizes a game where the goalposts continue to move, it's this sense of, oh my gosh, I can't even win. I can't even hit a benchmark. And when you have the moving of goalposts, or you have inconsistency within the game where sometimes these rules apply and sometimes they don't, and sometimes you get the consequence and the reward and there's no way to predict it, is that the game really does fall apart and the sense of meaning falls apart. And you don't want your game that you're projecting onto the universe, or that your child's projecting onto the universe, to fall apart, because that's where meaning falls apart. And consistency is the only thing that makes a game a game. If you don't have consistency within your game, you don't have a game at all. Another component of a good game is that it is not too hard and it's not too easy. It should be just hard enough to challenge you or challenge your child and to be a stretch, but not so hard that it becomes so frustrating that there's a resignation. So if it's way too hard, the kid gives up and says, what's the point? If it's way too easy, the kid just resigns from the game and says, oh, what's the point in playing this game? It's too easy. And another component of good games that dovetails off of this point is that good games are challenging but winnable. So this was maybe about, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And back then, my daughter was really, really into the movie Trolls. And so we were watching Trolls like a lot. And we ended up getting this game for her on a tablet that was a Trolls game. But it was really clear once we got it that it was like a crappy bootlegged game. And this game was absolutely unwinnable. Like, there was no way to win this game. So basically, it was that the level changed every single time. Like, you never went back to the same level ever again. And it was like it became progressively harder as you played through the level. And it was the case that you couldn't even practice to get better at it. And even if you could, I think there were certain elements of the game that were buggy and you couldn't even like win. You were kind of in a soft lock of the game. And so there were just so many components and it was so frustrating, and nobody ever beat a single level in that game. And there wasn't even a sense that there was an end to the level. Like, that it was like there could have been no end to any of the levels at all, or, it could have been just something that just generated more and more of the level. I didn't know. And so because I wasn't clear that there were endpoints within the game or levels or ways to win, what ended up happening is we didn't play the game for very long. We just kind of resigned from that game because there was no way to win it. Also, good games from let's say projecting them onto the universe over the course of your lifetime is that you want to make sure that your objective is a winning objective as opposed to an avoid losing objective, because the end of the game is death. And so with like avoid losing games, it's that you have to get to the end of the game without losing. And if the game only lasts for 15 minutes, that can be perfectly fun. So like Jenga is a lot of fun because it's like an avoid losing game, and like a Jenga game lasts like 15 minutes. It's no problem, right? But if you are playing a game that's all about avoiding losing and that's your entire life, and it's like, oh, I want to get to, I want to get to death without this bad thing happening or that bad thing happening or without the tower falling down, then that's going to be a problem. So you want to make sure that the game that you're projecting onto reality and that your child or children are projecting onto reality is something that can be won in the positive and not just to avoid negative consequences. Also, good games are games where your validity is never on the line in the game. So you can have many different things in the gameplay, but you want to make sure that your own sense of worthiness and validity to exist and to belong aren't in play in the game. You'll also want to avoid harsh and cruel gameplay rules within your game. Also, because we're playing a lifelong game here, we want to make sure that we have a trajectory for our game that can last us for our entire lifetime and still be meaningful, and that also has incremental chances of winning and celebrating successes every single day. So those are the components that make up a good game. Now, on the opposite side of that, we have inconsistent games that are not winnable, games that, you don't even necessarily know if there's a way to get to a win, or there's not incremental wins, or games where your sense of validity is on the line. All of those are games that you really don't want to be playing, and you certainly don't want to teach your children to play those games. And as I've said before, games are serious business. It's how we create a sense of meaning. And so you want to help your children and yourself create games where meaning can be derived. And so when, let's say, there is not a consistent sense of meaning that can be derived from the game, what the consequences are of that is that people start asking, okay, well, what's the point in playing this game? Like, why am I even here? And we can get into this sense of futility, and we can start even questioning, like what's even the point in engaging in life? And we can truly resign from life. I mean, think about it this way. Like, if you start playing a game that was like that Trolls game that I just mentioned, where you couldn't even get a single win, and it felt like the rules were just so impossible and overwhelming that you didn't even know if you could get any wins, period, then yeah, you might actually just be like, okay, screw this game, I'm not going to play this game anymore. So if life feels like that to someone, then that's going to put them in a really negative space. But what's lucky is that even if you're playing a game that currently is unwinnable, or that you don't feel a strong sense of meaning or investment in the game, or the game feels too overwhelming, or it's too easy, or it's too hard, or it's not consistent enough, luckily you are 100% in control of the game that you're playing. You just have to use shadow work to become conscious of the game that you're playing, and then you can consciously and deliberately change the objective and the rules of the game. So you are 100% the sovereign of your own game, and that's true even if your game is heavily influenced by your caregivers, your parents, your people people around you, your culture, all sorts of external forces might be playing out on your game, but it is ultimately you that chooses the game that you play. So if I think about the game that I typically would project onto reality, which is, let's be like special and hardworking and let me achieve things that, like, let's say are meaningful to me by being as different as possible and standing out under the consequence of like the universe like abhorring me if I don't match up to those standards. So instead of playing that game, the game that I would prefer to play is this, which is the Wheel of Fortune. Not the Wheel of Fortune like the game show, but the Wheel of Fortune like in the sense that you would spin the wheel and at random chance you would either get something positive, negative, or neutral that would happen. And then the challenge from there would be to take the positive, negative, and neutral elements that happen and to trust that no matter what comes out of that Wheel of Fortune, that it is always going to be a fortunate circumstance, a wanted circumstance. And so being able to alchemize the positive, negative, and neutral circumstances into more positive meaning, into wisdom, into something that even if it's a loss in the moment, that it adds to another win or leads to another win. And so in this game is very diametrically opposite of the game that I was originally indoctrinated to play. So with the game I was originally indoctrinated to play, it was all about like achieving and being very in control of those achievements and getting to a sense of like a wanted outcome and being the person that can make that happen. And this game is very much one of chance and of mystery and anticipation and of unconditional receptivity. And then the element of control that I have is in alchemizing and sort of transmuting every single one of those experiences into something that is greater than what it is that I receive. And there's also a lot of trust within this game as well, because it's receiving positive, negative, and neutral things and trusting that there's going to be some kind of exalted higher expression of whatever that is that comes through. Now, I know that I would find this very, very challenging as a framing if something truly tragic happened, and so it might not necessarily be the best game to play in those instances. But so far, the things that I've received that are negative are not so permanently negative, not so much of a permanent loss that would be hard for me to frame in that direction, or perhaps even unself-compassionate to frame in that sort of light. So that's the game that I prefer to play, and you can choose which game you prefer to play in the overall macrocosmic picture of your life. So not just all of the little games that you play in culture and commerce and institutions and all of these things, but the overall game that you project onto the universe, you get to choose that. And in fact, it's very important for you to recognize that you're the one that chooses your game. You are the one that is the sovereign of your own game. And when you don't realize that, what ends up happening is that you end up projecting the authority over your game onto external figures and onto potentially people who want to utilize that sense of meaning to be able to draw you into their sphere of influence. So that's people like demagogues and cult leaders. They want you to project onto them that they are the keeper of your own game and the one that creates the meaning within your game. But it is 100% you that creates the meaning of your game, even if you're projecting it onto another person. And so to own your position as the sovereign of your own game, you want to first identify what game you're already playing and projecting onto the universe at large. And so the first question to ask yourself is, what is your objective? And how clear are you on your objective? You know, are you confused about the reason why you're here and what game you're meant to be playing? Or do you know what your objective is? And are you consistently moving toward that objective? And is the objective something that's conscious to you, or is it something that's operating in the background? Another question you can ask yourself is, what are the rules of your game? What rules are you operating off of? What rules do you assume are inherent to the universe? Remembering that there are no rules inherent to the universe, only the ones that you project onto it. Are there certain things that are inherently positive or negative to do? Are there certain understandings that you feel like that other people should be following these rules as well, and you feel upset when other people aren't following those rules? You know, are there any rules that you're projecting onto reality? Also, does your game feel meaningful to you? And sometimes it can be the case that earlier on, maybe our game feels meaningful to us, and then that game can lose meaning. So I'm sort of in this space right now where things have gotten kind of stale, and I think it's because I'm still operating off an old game that lost its meaning long ago. And so basically being able to understand if your game is meaningful to you can show you whether or not it's time to shed that game or to begin anew. Along those same lines, you can also ask yourself, are there outcomes of the game that feel meaningful to you? And if so, which ones are that? Are there certain things that you really, really enjoy about your game? Are there elements that maybe you don't enjoy or maybe don't find as meaningful? So for example, if I think about my old game, I still like creating things that are interesting or, creating something novel or different. Those things are still quite interesting to me. But I don't necessarily find it interesting to always be having to differentiate myself all the time, because I sense that right now is a time for me to actually integrate more of the kind of ordinariness and connectedness element. You can also ask yourself, how consistent are the consequences and rewards of your game? Do you feel that making your winning moves will actually move you closer to winning your game or achieving your objective? Or do you feel like it doesn't matter? Is it the case that you feel like even if you're, let's say, doing all of the winning moves, that you're still going to lose? Or, are there things about the game that feel outside of your control and that feel inconsistent? The next question you can ask is it a winning game or is it an avoid losing game? And again, you want to make sure that you're playing a winning game if it's the game that you're projecting onto the universe as the game that you're playing through your entire life. Because an avoid losing game is only good when you have like a time limit that isn't involving death. So with life, your time limit is like the confines between now and the time that you pass away. And so you don't want to be playing an avoid losing game throughout your whole entire life, because it's just not satisfying. You don't get to celebrate any kind of in-game or in-life victory. And let's say that you are playing a winning game. The next question you would ask yourself is, do you believe that you can win your game? Or do you have limiting beliefs? Do you feel like your game isn't winnable in general, or that you're just not the person that can win that game? Also, you can ask yourself, what would you title your game? What would you call your game? So for me, let's say the game that I would prefer to play would be like Wheel of Fortune. Let's say Wheel of Fortune Alchemy. And then the game that I've been playing is sort of like dancing on a floating log. Stay up on the floating log as long as possible while you're also dancing and trying to make the coolest dance possible. Also, are you playing a game that already exists as like a board game or a card game or a sports game? Sometimes we can be playing games with the universe where it really does exist in just regular game form. So for example, if let's say, kind of dancing on a floating log, it's very similar to the game of running on a floating log. And I would say that oftentimes reality can kind of feel like I'm playing a game of running on a floating log. Another question you can ask yourself is, how hard or how easy is your game? So you want your game to be hard enough to be challenging, but easy enough to be winnable. And so is your game too hard? Is your game too easy? Either one can really throw you off. So in the story of the Buddha, he first starts off with like leaving his palace, leaving his place of luxury after he sees all of this suffering, and he goes out and he lives this ascetic life where he only eats a few grains of rice per day. And after a time of living this really extreme ascetic life, he comes across this person who's playing this stringed instrument. And he overhears this person saying, oh, if you wind the string too tight, it will break. Or if you wind it too loose, it won't play. And so for him, it gave him this realization that he needed to find the middle path and to go the middle way, to not go to extremes like asceticism, but to find the center path where he can really move forward. And so you want to create your game very similarly to that, where it's not too easy because that's the string that's too loose and doesn't play, and it's not too hard because then it's too tightly wound and might break. So you want to find a really good balance of challenge and ease within your game. And so you want to ask yourself, how difficult is your game? How easy is your game? Is it too difficult? Is it too easy? Along these same lines, is your game engaging? If it's too difficult or too easy, it won't be engaging, but then there can also be other reasons why your game isn't engaging for you. And within your game, relative to your objective, what are your winning moves and what are your losing moves? And what are the consequences of winning and what are the consequences of losing the game? And also, are you well suited to the game that you're playing? So let's say, for example, all of my innate talents and things like that have to do with more internal things, like let's say more creative endeavors. But let's say that I learned that like the game is that I have to be the most physically fit person who's the most athletic, and it's like I'm just not as well equipped for that game. And so what might happen then is that I might feel like I'm in an unwinnable game because it's just not lined up with my natural aptitudes. And so you want to question and see, is the game that you're playing unconsciously and projecting it onto the universe at large, is it a game that you feel like you can be successful at and that you can play well? Not as a thing where you're rounding your own weaknesses, but as something where you're really aligned with your strength. Then you can also think about what scenarios in your life has your game influenced. So for example, like my whole thing of like, creating interesting things and sort of standing out and like being special and this kind of thing. On the more positive side, some of the scenarios in life that's created is like me finding a lot of like sort of my zones of competence, things that pertain to creativity and painting, and also let's say kind of the thing that I'm doing now with my channel when it comes to being able to communicate insight. So that's the more positive side, but it's also led to these other scenarios where there's been lots of insecurities and like this feeling of being on this treadmill, and if I don't keep running on this treadmill then I'm going to be this invalid person, and how that's led to like a lot of stress and a lot of almost like obsessive rumination about trying to avoid being abhorred by the universe or to try to avoid being invalid. And that's by no means an exhaustive list of all the questions you can ask to determine your current game, but that gives you a good starting place to understand your game. And what I recommend is to write down all of the rules of the game, all of the objectives of the game, the outcomes, everything like that. And now we're going to get into the final component of the game. Now that you have asked these questions to identify what game you're currently playing, you want to start building the game and shifting over to the game that you would rather be playing. And so what you want to do first is you want to select your desired objective. So that way you have a clear sense of what game you're playing and what it is you're trying to move toward. And you want to make sure that this objective is really truly meaningful to you. And having a clear objective is one of the most important components of the game, because without an objective, you have no game. What's also important, and I'll emphasize this especially, is to never have your worthiness or validity or your existence be in the gameplay. What that means is that, if you lose the game, you can never lose your sense of validity. So anytime you involve your own sense of validity and the validity of your being in the gameplay, it just produces shame and it creates a lot of stress within the game. So it becomes this extra difficult, overwhelming thing. Instead of just playing the game, you have to kind of play it with these huge stakes, and the stakes are overwhelming for a human being to deal with. Also very important is to be consistent with all of your game components. That means be consistent with your objective, be consistent with your rules, be consistent with your procedures, be consistent with your winning and losing moves, and be consistent with your consequences and rewards. Remember, if you have no consistency, it means you have no game. And if you have no game, you have no meaning. Also, make sure that your game is not too easy and not too difficult. It should always be just a little bit challenging for you, a little bit of a stretch, and that's what's the most engaging. You also want to give yourself a reasonable margin for victory. So the example that I had given earlier is of, let's say, the child showing their test to their parents, like, oh, look, mom, I got 99%, and the mom goes, oh, well, why wasn't it 100? What ends up happening then is that it gives us a sense that the margin for victory is very, very narrow. And so that means that it becomes this really difficult, overwhelming thing that's so far beyond our reach, where it's like, oh no, the goalpost will always move move. I have to be 100% perfect to win this game. We want to make sure that we're not expecting perfection. So what we want to do is we want to have a reasonable margin for victory. Not so wide that it becomes too easy, but not so small that it's impossible to actually hit that margin. And so a good 20% margin of victory or a 15% margin of victory is pretty good. Also, given that this game is all-encompassing, that we're projecting onto reality itself, and because it spans our entire life, we want to make sure that we build in incremental sort of times for celebration and being able to experience incremental wins. It's kind of like in a video game. If you have a big, long video game, you want to make sure that you have checkpoints and levels and worlds and all sorts of different ways of compartmentalizing the game. And so for me, if my game is like the Wheel of Fortune and it's about trying to produce more exalted insights or outputs based off of whatever it is that I unconditionally receive, then it's like being able to, in every day or even once a week or once a month, to have these periodic times where I can get a sense where I can celebrate sort of the outcomes of that game, or to feel like I've really gotten a win. And along those same lines, you want to create in the gameplay opportunities to celebrate wins and to have a tendency to celebrate wins. You want to make sure that wins are directly in the context of your game that you're creating. You also want to make sure that the objective of the game is to win something in the positive and not to avoid losing. So instead of building your, let's say, game as running on a floating log and let's tread water and make sure that we avoid the shark that's in the water or this kind of thing, instead create something that's really compelling as an objective and a goal. So that objective, maybe it could be something like, trying to realize more of your potential as part of the game, or maybe you're trying to have lots of experiences as part of your game. There can be a variety of different objectives, but you want it to be something that's in the positive so that you have something to work toward. You also want to avoid really harsh game rules and game dynamics. I remember talking to somebody once who had said that their assumption about the world, and we weren't talking about this in the context of the game, but they were talking about how sometimes they would have this assumption that if something positive were to happen in life, that would mean that 2 more negative things would happen. And so of course, if you have a rule like that you're understanding in the gameplay, what that's going to do is that's going to create a negative feeling around positive things happening, because it means that every time something positive happens, that there's going to be something that's even more negative that's going to happen as well. So what you want to do is you want to weed out any kind of punishing sort of gameplay dynamics and punishing rules from your game. And finally, you also want to align your game with your natural strengths, not rounding your weaknesses, but actually playing to your natural strengths. So a fish playing the game of let's ride the bicycle is going to fail at that game. It's going to be a huge struggle if that's the universal game that this fish is trying to play. But a fish can really excel at the swimming game. And so if they're playing that game, they're going to be much more adept at it, and it's going to be a much more satisfying gameplay. So just as a recap, what you want to do is you want to realize that you're always playing games all the time. You want to identify your universal game, which is usually something that's set up by your early caregivers, something that's there in the background that you're unconscious to, that you might be taking for granted or sort of projecting rules into reality or objectives into reality that aren't actually there. You want to become conscious of what that is, and then from a sovereign place, you want to consciously and deliberately decide what objectives you want to be playing towards, what game you actually want to be playing, what the rules are, what the winning moves and losing moves are. You get to choose all of these things. Anyways, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button down below and subscribe, and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you would like a free checklist of the 5 reasons for self-sabotage, which also has a little bit of information about each one of those things, go ahead and click the link down below in the description box, and I'll also leave it down in the comments as well, and so you can get that free resource there. And also, if you would like to learn more about shadow work, go ahead and click this video right here. And until next time, keep becoming more you.